In the gentle embrace of a European springtime, as soft breezes whispered through the awakening valleys of France, a tale of remarkable transformation was about to unfold, one destined to forever alter the course of history. The year was 1796, a time of profound uncertainty and change. The old world of kings and queens was reeling, and France itself, like a delicate flower pushing its way through the last of the winter frost, was embarking on a new and unknown journey. It was during these fragile and turbulent times that a young general, barely 26 years old, his name not yet a legend but a quiet promise, Napoleon Bonaparte, received an extraordinary opportunity. Imagine, if you will, the tranquil Italian countryside as he saw it then. Picture the rolling hills of Piedmont, where ancient stone walls, draped in ivy, whisper secrets of empires past. See the morning mists that cloak the valleys, blanketing the promises of the coming day in a soft, ethereal light. Into this serene and timeless setting stepped our protagonist. He was a man of modest height, but his heart was filled with dreams as vast and boundless as the Mediterranean sky that stretched above him. He had been given a command, a chance to prove his worth. But the instrument he was given, the army of Italy entrusted to his care, was like a garden that had been long and cruelly neglected. Its soldiers were weary, their uniforms faded like autumn leaves, their spirits eroded by months of hardship and lack of pay. Their supplies were meager, their cannons few, their boots worn through. It was an army not on the verge of victory, but on the edge of collapse, its spirit yearning only for renewal, for a reason to believe again. Many a general would have seen only despair in this ragged force. But Napoleon, with the eyes of an artist, saw something different. He saw a raw and beautiful potential in this imperfect canvas. Like a master painter with a fresh but empty palette, he began to compose his masterpiece, not with oils and pigments, but with strokes of brilliant strategy, with gentle determination, and with a profound understanding of the human heart. His methods, in the midst of the chaos and brutality of war, were akin to a soothing lullaby. Where other generals moved with predictable, heavy force, his army seemed to flow. His movements were swift, yet graceful, bold, yet perfectly measured. Each strategic decision flowed into the next like verses in a peaceful and elegant poem. He did not command from a distant tent, he lived among his men, sharing their hardships, eating their meager rations, and speaking to them not as a superior, but as a fellow soldier who understood their suffering and shared their dreams of glory. He reminded them of their purpose, painting for them a vision of the rich plains of Lombardy, of the honor and wealth that awaited them. His words were a beacon of hope, illuminating a path forward and transforming this weary, threadbare army into a formidable force, a polished bronze instrument capable of altering the course of history. Through the quiet valleys and over the sleeping mountains of the Alps, he guided his men with the patience and care of a shepherd leading his flock to greener pastures. His enemies, the Austrians and the Sardinians, were comfortable in their traditional ways of war, wrapped in the familiar blankets of their old, slow-moving strategies. They never imagined that this young dreamer, this unknown Corsican general, would so completely reshape their world, and do so with such elegant, lightning-fast precision. He struck not where they were strongest, but where they were divided, his army moving like dancers in a grand, coordinated ballet, appearing where they were least expected, achieving victory before their opponents had even fully understood that the performance had begun. As the moonlight bathed the Italian plains in silver, Napoleon's vision unfolded like a bedtime story that was being written in the stars themselves. Each chapter brought new and unexpected wonders. Each victory at Montagnat, at Lodi, at Arcole, added another golden thread to the magnificent tapestry of his rising legacy. His name began to be whispered, first with curiosity, then with astonishment, and finally with awe. And so, dear listener, as we settle into this tale of destiny and dreams, let us journey together through the gentle, yet profound, revolution that began in those hopeful spring days of 1796. For in this story, we shall discover how one soul's quiet, unwavering determination could awaken a sleeping continent to possibilities it had never before dared to imagine. Let us journey forward in time, to the year 1809. The vibrant, revolutionary springtime of the Italian campaign has matured into the high, majestic summer of empire. Napoleon Bonaparte is no longer just a celebrated general, he is the Emperor of the French, and he now stands at the absolute apex of his power and influence. Imagine him in the grand, gilded halls of the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the silence broken only by the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth. He has just returned from the battlefields of Austria, having crushed another coalition at the decisive Battle of Wagram. He is the master of the continent, a figure of almost mythical proportions, his will a force of nature that has humbled ancient monarchies and redrawn the map of Europe according to his own grand design. Before him, on vast, polished mahogany tables, lie the maps of his domain. They are a testament to his genius. The territories are shaded in the confident colors of the French Empire and its satellite kingdoms, a sprawling tapestry of conquest and control that stretches from the coast of France to the plains of Poland. He can trace with his finger the paths of his victorious campaigns, the sites of legendary battles, the capitals that have bowed to his might. Yet, even in this moment of supreme and seemingly unassailable triumph, his gaze is drawn to a difficult, frustrating corner of the map. It is a stubborn section that refuses to be neatly colored and controlled, a place that seems to absorb his armies and his resources with no decisive result. This is the Iberian Peninsula. His decision, made the previous year, to invade Spain and Portugal was now proving to be a profound miscalculation, a festering wound that stubbornly refused to heal. It was becoming his Spanish shadow. The source of this persistent fire was a single, political choice that had deeply offended the pride of a fierce and ancient people. Napoleon, in his desire to bind Spain to his imperial system, had swept aside their king and placed his own brother, Joseph, upon the Spanish throne. What he had intended as a simple administrative change was seen by the Spanish people as an intolerable national humiliation. A rebellion, born of wounded pride and religious fervor, spread like wildfire across the rugged landscape. This was not a war of professional armies meeting on open fields, but something far more primal. The French responded with their characteristic force. In February of 1809, Marshal Lannes captured the city of Zaragoza after a grueling and infamous siege. The battle was a nightmare of house-to-house fighting, where every street, every building, every room was savagely contested. The eventual French victory came at a terrible cost, with some accounts claiming over 54,000 Spanish lives were lost, alongside 10,000 of France's own soldiers. But even this devastating show of force did not extinguish the fire. Instead, it seemed only to fuel it, and the indomitable spirit of the Iberians refused to be broken. Into this volatile and bloody arena, a new and formidable player arrived from across the sea. Just 3 months after an earlier British expeditionary force had been forced into a retreat, Great Britain, Napoleon's most steadfast enemy, sent a new army. It was led by a general whose name would become inextricably linked with Napoleon's own destiny, Sir Arthur Wellesley. He arrived in Lisbon with a quiet confidence and a methodical mind that stood in stark contrast to Napoleon's fiery genius. He immediately set to work, and under his steady and disciplined guidance, the Portuguese troops were quickly transformed from a demoralized force into a formidable fighting army. Within weeks of his arrival, Wellesley demonstrated his intent and his capability. He launched a sudden, brilliantly executed surprise attack on Marshal Soult's Second Corps, who were occupying the coastal city of Porto. The French troops, complacent and disorganized in the midst of their plundering, were caught completely off guard. Wellesley's forces crossed the wide Douro River in broad daylight, using wine barges sourced by the local population, a feat the French had deemed impossible. The ensuing panic was total. Soult's army, stunned and routed, fled in a chaotic retreat back into the mountains of Spain. With this single, swift stroke, Portugal was temporarily secured. With Portugal reclaimed, Wellesley's ambition grew. He aimed to push into Spain itself, to take the fight to the French occupiers. For this, he needed allies. He arranged to join forces with a Spanish army led by the notoriously difficult, elderly, and fiercely proud General Cuesta. Imagine their meeting in a dusty campaign tent somewhere near the Spanish border. The air is thick with a formal, cautious respect, but also with a deep and pervasive mistrust. Centuries of conflict and rivalry between Spain and Great Britain created an invisible barrier between the two commanders. The Spanish were wary of British intentions on their soil, suspecting them of having their own imperial ambitions. The British, in turn, were deeply skeptical of the Spanish army's leadership, which they viewed as antiquated, and its army's reliability in a pitched battle. Wellesley, ever the pragmatist, requested to be given supreme command of both forces to ensure a unified strategy. His request was flatly denied by the proud Spanish. The result was a tense and uneasy cooperation, an agreement to advance together up the Tagus Valley toward the grand prize of Madrid, but not as a single, cohesive unit. This joint offensive, born of necessity but plagued by discord, became the new focal point of the Peninsular War. It was a campaign where the promise of glorious conquest flirted constantly with the threat of sudden catastrophe, a stage where fragile alliances would be tested and the very fabric of empire would be strained. The shadow of Spain, once a small and distant concern for an emperor at the height of his power, was now lengthening, growing darker, and beginning to demand a heavy price in blood and gold that would slowly, inexorably, drain the strength of his magnificent empire. While the grand movements of Wellington's conventional forces and the strategic maneuvers of the French marshals captured the headlines and the attention of Europe, another kind of warfare was transforming the very nature of the conflict in Spain. Since the beginning of the occupation in 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, alongside scattered militia forces and former soldiers, had been waging their own relentless war against the French invaders. This was not a war of pitched battles and glorious charges, it was a war of 1,000 cuts, a contest fought in the shadows. It was characterized by sudden, vicious ambushes on lonely roads and lightning-fast raids on isolated outposts. In the Spanish language, it was known as La Guerrilla, the Little War. And its practitioners, the guerrillas, would give their name to this style of fighting for all of history. Imagine the landscape of Spain itself as a silent, brooding participant in this conflict. The rugged, challenging terrain, with its steep mountains, its dense forests, and its isolated, tight-knit communities, became a great ally to the resistance. Much of this vast and difficult countryside fell under the control of various guerrilla bands, each led by charismatic and ruthless leaders who would become legendary figures in Spanish history. North of Madrid, one of the most prominent was a former soldier named Juan Martín Díaz, known to friend and foe alike as El Empecinado, the Stubborn One. The nickname perfectly captured the unyielding spirit of the Spanish resistance, and his formidable force of some 6,000 fighters demonstrated how these irregular units could grow to rival the size of conventional military formations. In the northern region of Navarre, a former peasant named Espaz y Mina developed one of the most sophisticated and feared guerrilla operations of the entire war. His organization specifically targeted the vital French supply and communication route along the Burgos-Bayonne road. But Mina understood that this was also a psychological war. In a move that became a terrifying legend among the occupiers, he would brand the foreheads of those who collaborated with the French with the words "Viva Mina," creating a powerful and permanent deterrent against cooperation. In the West, another leader, Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, demonstrated the guerrilla's flair for symbolic defiance. He proudly wore the cap of a captured French hussar, but with its imperial eagle emblem deliberately turned upside down, a small but potent gesture of mockery and humiliation that epitomized the spirit of the resistance. While these leaders became celebrated heroes, the reality of this little war was far from romantic. The conflict devolved into a brutal and vicious cycle of atrocity and revenge. For the French soldiers occupying the land, life became a state of constant, nerve-shredding tension. They learned to dread capture by the guerrilla forces, where a swift death on the battlefield was often a preferable fate. This brutal nature of the conflict meant that no Frenchman was safe. Even the smallest units required significant protection. A messenger carrying a dispatch between two marshals could not travel alone. His group required an escort of 200 or more cavalry, and even then, many never reached their destination. The intercepted messages would often find their way to Wellington's headquarters, providing him with crucial intelligence that helped coordinate his conventional army with the unending, disruptive actions of the irregulars. This guerrilla campaign proved to be remarkably and devastatingly effective. It forced the French to disperse their armies into smaller and smaller units, just to protect their vital supply lines and lines of communication from constant attack. This, in turn, created an impossible strategic dilemma. When the French concentrated their forces to face Wellington's powerful conventional army in a major battle, the guerrillas would immediately rise up and reclaim control of the countryside, undoing months of work. But when they dispersed their forces to hunt down the guerrillas and secure the provinces, they became vulnerable to a sudden, decisive strike from Wellington's concentrated army. It was a strategic trap from which there was no easy escape. The scale of the French losses in Spain was staggering, a slow, constant bleed that drained the strength of the empire. In total, some 260,000 French soldiers would ultimately perish in the conflict. And following the grim pattern of warfare in this era, disease proved to be a far deadlier enemy than combat. 3 out of every 4 French casualties were claimed not by a Spanish knife or a British musket ball, but by illnesses like typhus and dysentery. This high disease rate was made much worse by the guerrilla strategy of targeting supply lines, which often left the French troops malnourished, undersupplied, and far more susceptible to sickness. Napoleon himself, watching from afar, recognized the severity of the situation. He famously referred to the intractable conflict in Spain as his bleeding ulcer, a persistent and painful wound that refused to heal, steadily draining his resources and his morale. The daily toll of casualties, a constant drain on the empire's military strength, would become particularly significant in the years to come, as the emperor began to turn his gaze eastward, toward the vast, frozen plains of Russia, all while the great wound of Spain continued to bleed. While the bleeding ulcer of Spain continued to drain the resources and morale of his empire, events of even greater magnitude, like the slow gathering of storm clouds on a distant horizon, were unfolding 2,000 miles to the east. The roots of this new and far more dangerous crisis stretched back to the summer of 1807, to a moment of celebrated friendship and grand spectacle. Imagine a great, ornate raft, moored in the middle of the wide and sleepy Niemen River. This river was a border, a line separating the French-controlled West from the vast, mysterious lands of the Russian Empire. On that raft, following a decisive French victory at the Battle of Friedland, 2 of the most powerful men on earth met face to face, Napoleon, the master of Europe, and Alexander I, the young, charismatic, an enigmatic emperor of all the Russias. It was a moment of high political theater, marked by apparent camaraderie and mutual understanding, a celebrated meeting that would prove to be the fragile high-water mark of Franco-Russian cooperation. For 5 years, this crucial and unlikely alliance held the peace in Europe. It was a delicate balance of power resting on the shoulders of these two giants, a pact born of military necessity and a flicker of genuine, if cautious, mutual admiration. But the bonds of friendship, especially between emperors whose very beings are tied to the destinies of their nations, are often strained by the relentless pressures of politics and divergent interests. The deterioration of this vital relationship occurred gradually, a slow erosion over 5 years, driven by multiple sources of tension, like a series of small, hairline cracks spreading across a magnificent vase. The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, a Polish state carved from Prussian territory by Napoleon, was one of the first and deepest of these cracks. To Napoleon, it was a strategic buffer state and a reward for his loyal Polish allies. But to the Russian court, it was a profound alarm. They viewed it as a direct French interference in their traditional sphere of influence and harbored a deep-seated fear that it might be the first step toward the resurrection of a fully independent and powerful Polish state, which had historically been a significant threat to Russia's western borders. Personal matters further strained the relationship, weaving threads of private slight into the grand tapestry of geopolitical maneuvering. Napoleon, seeking to solidify his dynasty and gain the legitimacy of the old European monarchies, pursued a marriage alliance with the Tsar's own sister, the Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna. But his proposal was met with a prolonged and frustrating prevarication from the Russian court, a series of polite but firm delays that were a clear reflection of the Romanov family's deep reservations about a union with the Corsican upstart. Napoleon's subsequent marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria, a Habsburg princess, represented not just a personal rejection for Alexander, but a significant and worrying diplomatic reorientation, aligning France with one of Russia's traditional rivals. The situation worsened when Napoleon, in a move that violated his own guarantees made at Tilsit, annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose ruler was a close relative of the Russian imperial family. Each of these events was another chip in the foundation of their alliance, another reason for suspicion to replace the celebrated friendship of Tilsit. However, the most severe strain, the issue that would finally break the alliance and make war inevitable, came from economic policy. The continental system, Napoleon's ambitious and all-consuming attempt to strangle his most hated and resilient enemy, Great Britain, through a Europe-wide economic blockade, proved to be particularly damaging to Russian interests. It was the central pillar of his grand strategy, but for Russia, it was a slow poison. While Alexander had reluctantly agreed to participate in this blockade at Tilsit, its implementation during a severe economic crisis had a catastrophic impact on Russian finances, which were heavily dependent on the timber and grain trade with Great Britain. The Russian nobility grew restless as their incomes dwindled. The nation's treasury began to empty. The eventual resumption of clandestine trade between Russia and Britain, a violation of the treaty, was a reflection of both desperate economic necessity and a growing Russian resistance to French dominance. Napoleon's reaction to this perceived betrayal was furious. He saw it not as an act of economic self-preservation by a struggling partner, but as a direct challenge to his authority, a defiant tear in the fabric of his imperial system. The drift toward war, once a slow and subtle current, now accelerated into a powerful, unstoppable torrent. His mind was made up. Despite the ongoing, draining commitment of over 200,000 of his finest troops to the intractable conflict in Spain, Napoleon made the fateful decision to turn his attention eastward. He began to assemble a new army, an army of such unprecedented scale that it would dwarf any military force yet assembled in European history. The storm clouds that had been gathering on the eastern horizon were now coalescing into a tempest of unimaginable power, ready to be unleashed upon the vast plains of Russia. The friendship of giants had crumbled into dust, and the world held its breath, waiting for the thunder to begin. The decision was made. The friendship was over. In the mind of Napoleon, there was now only one course of action. He began to assemble an invasion force of a scale that was simply without precedent in European history. Imagine a great river of humanity, its tributaries flowing from every corner of the continent, all converging on the plains of Poland. This was the Grand Army of 1812. It was a multinational force of approximately 600,000 men, a staggering number that represented both the immense power of Napoleon's empire and its inherent weaknesses. Less than half of these soldiers were French. The remainder were a remarkable coalition from conquered and allied states, Poles fighting for the dream of a restored nation, Italians from the Kingdom of Italy, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, and, most uncomfortably, large contingents of Prussians and Austrians, men from recently defeated powers, now compelled to march under the banner of the man who had humbled their own emperors. Napoleon organized this massive force into three main armies, with the central body under his own direct command, and two subsidiary forces led by his stepson, Eugene, and his brother, Jerome. The selection of these relatively inexperienced family members for such crucial roles was perhaps the first sign of the strain that years of constant warfare had placed upon his pool of military leadership. On the other side, the Russian response demonstrated a quiet and impressive strategic acumen. Though initially outnumbered almost 2-1, with only around 220,000 troops to defend their vast homeland, Russian diplomacy had been hard at work. They had secured peace with the Ottoman Empire to their south and neutralized any potential threat from Sweden to their north, allowing them to concentrate all their forces against the coming French invasion. On the 24th of June 1812, the Great Invasion began. Napoleon, never one for modest undertakings, watched as his army began to cross the wide, sleepy Niemen River into Russia. The crossing itself was a spectacle of immense logistical complexity. It took 5 full days just to get the entire army across. Napoleon's plan, in his mind, was brilliant and simple. He would strike north of the vast Pripet marshes, a treacherous bit of terrain, aiming to catch and crush the main Russian force, Barclay de Tolly's First Army, in a single, decisive battle. He believed the entire campaign could be over in 5 weeks. But here, a delicious and terrible irony began to unfold. The sheer, unprecedented size of Napoleon's army, the very thing that was meant to guarantee his victory, actually began to work against him. The Russian general, Barclay, being a sensible and cautious man, took one look at the approaching behemoth and thought better of a direct confrontation. Even the famously aggressive Prince Bagration, usually about as cautious as a wolf in a sheep pen, had to agree that retreat was the only viable option. The Russians began to withdraw, melting away into the endless expanse of the Russian interior. And as they retreated, they practiced a grim and ancient art of war. They burned everything. They adopted a scorched earth policy, leaving nothing for the invading army. Villages, crops, haystacks, mills, all were set to the torch. They left behind a wasteland, a landscape of black ash and silence. Napoleon reached Vilnius in 4 days, only to find that Barclay had performed a spectacular vanishing act. But a far greater enemy than the Russian army was beginning to reveal itself, the land itself. Napoleon, who had organized his supply depots with his usual meticulous attention to detail, discovered that the Russian roads were not like the paved highways of France or Germany. They were little more than dirt tracks, and as the summer thunderstorms rolled in, they turned into thick, impassable rivers of mud. The great supply wagons, the very lifeblood of the army, moved slower than a walking man. The Grand Army, once as swift and deadly as a striking cobra, had transformed into something more akin to a heavily sedated elephant, its own weight and size becoming its greatest burden. The young conscripts, many of whom had probably never walked further than their own village markets, began to drop from exhaustion and sickness. The desertion rate began to climb. Then there were the horses. 250,000 of them had started the campaign, the muscle that pulled the cannons and the supply wagons, the legs of the cavalry. But the scorched earth provided no fodder, and they began to die at an astonishing rate of 1,000 per day. Without horses, the cavalry couldn't scout, the wagons couldn't move, and the entire operation began to grind to a halt. Adding to the misery were the Cossacks. These magnificent, maverick horsemen of the Russian steppes didn't fight in formal lines of battle. They were, as Napoleon recognized, like wasps at a picnic, constantly buzzing on the flanks, striking foraging parties, picking off stragglers, and then vanishing as quickly as they appeared. After a 16-day halt at Vitebsk, Napoleon faced a sobering reality. His army had shrunk by a staggering 20% without having fought a single major battle. The silent, microscopic enemies of typhus and dysentery were having a field day, proving to be just as deadly as any Russian musket. But did this deter the determined emperor? Of course not. He decided to push on, gambling that the Russians would eventually have to turn and fight for their ancient city of Smolensk. The largest army Europe had ever seen was now marching deeper into an endless, hostile land, bleeding strength with every step, being slowly consumed not by an enemy army, but by the vast, silent, and unforgiving emptiness of Russia itself. The great army pushed deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Russia, and a profound weariness began to settle upon it like the fine, gray dust of the endless roads. For weeks, they had been marching through a haunted, empty landscape. Napoleon, a man whose entire military career was built on swift, decisive action, found himself engaged in a frustrating, phantom-like chase. The Russian armies, under the cautious command of Barclay de Tolly, were a shimmering heat haze on the horizon, always visible, yet always retreating, always just beyond his grasp. They refused to give battle. Instead, they left behind a trail of desolation, a scorched and empty land that offered no sustenance, only the grim sight of burning villages and the bitter taste of ash in the wind. This war of attrition, of endless marching and dwindling supplies, was a kind of psychological torture for the emperor and his men, and he knew it could not continue. He needed to force a confrontation, to trap and annihilate the Russian army, to bring this ghostly campaign to a swift and glorious conclusion. And so, with a flash of the strategic genius that had once conquered a continent, he devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. It would become known as the Smolensk Maneuver. While a portion of his army, led by the flamboyant cavalry Marshal Murat, continued a direct pursuit to fix the Russians' attention, Napoleon would take the main body of his force on a great, secret, sweeping flanking movement to the south. The plan was to cross the wide and sleepy Dnieper River, storm the ancient and holy city of Smolensk from the side, and place his army squarely on the Russian line of retreat. It was a classic Napoleonic stroke, designed to force the decisive battle he so desperately craved. By the evening of August 13, his forces had reached the riverbank. Under the cover of darkness, French engineers worked with remarkable, disciplined speed, constructing 4 pontoon bridges over the dark water. As dawn broke the next day, the French army began to pour across the river, a silent, disciplined flood of men and steel, their spirits renewed, believing once again in the invincibility of their emperor. However, what could have been a decisive, war-ending moment was blunted by the heroic and almost suicidal resistance of a single Russian unit. The 27th Division, realizing the profound peril to the main army, conducted a desperate, fighting retreat from the town of Krasny. They stood their ground with incredible, stubborn courage, throwing themselves in the path of the French advance, slowing it just long enough for Prince Bagration to rush his own forces into Smolensk and reinforce its garrison. The golden opportunity for a surprise assault on a weakly defended city had slipped through Napoleon's fingers. And then, in a moment of uncharacteristic and perplexing complacency, perhaps overconfident in the brilliance of his plan, Napoleon halted his army. The advance was paused, and a grand parade was held, a review of his troops to celebrate his 43rd birthday. It was a costly and fatal delay. The element of surprise was now completely lost. When the attack on Smolensk finally commenced 2 days later, it was a direct, frontal assault against a now well-defended city. 150 French cannons opened a thunderous bombardment, a continuous, deafening roar as their iron balls hammered against the city's ancient, medieval fortifications. 3 entire army corps, wave after wave of blue-coated infantry, were thrown against the defiant stone walls. The Russians, protected by the thick ramparts, defended bravely, their positions resolute. But their commander, the ever-cautious Barclay de Tolly, was always mindful of the greater strategic picture. His goal was not to win a single battle at any cost, but to preserve the Russian army. As the French fought their way through the battered walls and into the outer suburbs of the city, he once again gave the order that had defined the campaign: they would withdraw. But they would not leave Smolensk as a prize for the conqueror. As the French advanced, the Russians retreated, leaving only devastation in their wake. They set fire to their own city. The battle for Smolensk became a battle for a burning inferno. The French soldiers, fighting their way through streets choked with smoke, found themselves conquering not a living city, but a howling, roaring furnace. It was a victory that felt like a defeat, a conquest that yielded only ash. The Russian retreat itself nearly turned disastrous for them. At a place called Valutino, Napoleon's most determined marshal, Ney, and his Third Corps caught up with the Russian rearguard. A golden opportunity presented itself to trap and destroy a significant portion of the retreating Russian army. But in a moment that would infuriate the Emperor, General Junot, commanding the Westphalian 8th Corps on the other side of the river, inexplicably remained passive. He failed to advance, failed to close the trap, and the Russians slipped away. Napoleon's fury was immense. The strain on his command structure was beginning to show. He later declared that for this inexplicable failure, Junot would never earn his marshal's baton. The battle for Smolensk, while costing both sides around 10,000 casualties and destroying one of Russia's most historic and sacred cities, had failed to achieve any decisive strategic result for Napoleon. He paused again, this time amidst the smoking, blackened ruins, to evaluate his options. His army was exhausted, depleted by combat and disease, and far from its supply bases. The long Russian winter was no longer a distant threat, it was drawing nearer with each passing day. The prudent choice, the logical choice, as advised by some of his marshals, would have been to halt, to make Smolensk his winter quarters and resume the campaign in the spring of 1813. Yet, the great prize, the ancient capital of Moscow, the spiritual heart of Russia, lay just 230 miles ahead. It was a siren's call that he could not resist. He was a gambler, and his entire life had been a series of audacious, world-changing gambles. He believed that the Russians would have to stand and fight for their ancient capital. There, he would finally have his decisive battle. And so, he made the fateful decision. He would push on, deeper into the vastness of Russia, marching his weary army away from the smoldering embers of Smolensk and towards the great, bloody fields of Borodino. The long, phantom-like chase across the Russian plains was finally over. The new Russian Supreme Commander, the old, cunning, and deeply Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov, had made his decision. He recognized that the continued retreat was devastating both military and national morale. To surrender the holy, ancient capital of Moscow without a fight was politically unthinkable. And so, on a series of rolling hills and open fields some 70 miles west of the city, at a place named Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make its stand. They dug into the earth, their hands raw, their faces grim with determination, constructing massive fortifications, a large, central earthwork known as the Great Redoubt, and a series of smaller, arrow-shaped V-flèches to its south. This was where the fate of Moscow, and perhaps the entire campaign, would be decided. The prelude to the great battle began with a fierce and costly struggle for a forward Russian position, the Shevardino Redoubt. The fighting was a grim foreshadowing of the brutal, attritional nature of the conflict to come, with the position changing hands multiple times before the Russians finally withdrew. That evening, under a tense and watchful sky, Napoleon's most capable subordinate, Marshal Davout, proposed an ambitious plan for a wide flanking movement to the south, to avoid the terrible, inevitable cost of a direct frontal assault. But Napoleon, perhaps still underestimating the sheer tenacity of his enemy, rejected the suggestion as too risky. The die was cast. The battle would be a head-on collision of two immense forces. As dawn broke on the 7th of September, a powerful and spiritual moment unfolded in the Russian lines. Orthodox priests, in their flowing black robes and carrying golden icons, walked along the ranks of the waiting soldiers. They held aloft one of Russia's most sacred treasures, the icon of Our Lady of Smolensk, and the deeply religious Russian soldiers, many of them simple peasants, bowed their heads in solemn prayer, committing their souls to God before the coming struggle. Then, at precisely 6 a.m., the French artillery opened fire. A thunderous, earth-shaking bombardment from nearly 600 guns erupted along the entire front, a terrifying, man-made apocalypse of sound and fury designed to shatter the Russian defenses. The battle for Borodino had begun. The main thrust of the French attack was directed against the heavily defended flèches on the Russian left, commanded by the fiery Prince Bagration. Wave after wave of French infantry, the veterans of a dozen campaigns, advanced into a storm of Russian cannon fire. The fighting here devolved into a brutal, close-quarters cauldron of chaos. The French would capture one of the earthworks, only to be thrown out again by a ferocious Russian countercharge at bayonet point. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke, the ground slick with blood. At the height of the struggle, a devastating blow fell upon the Russian army. Prince Bagration, their inspirational and beloved commander, was mortally wounded by shell fragments while rallying his men. His loss sent a shockwave of despair through the Russian lines, and the French, sensing the weakness, finally managed to overwhelm the flèches after hours of relentless, attritional combat. In the center of the line, another epic struggle was taking place for the Great Redoubt. After being repulsed several times, the French launched a massive combined assault. French cavalry, their breastplates gleaming, swept around the flanks of the redoubt to attack from the rear, cutting down the Russian gunners, while Eugene's infantry charged its front. The redoubt fell in a scene of unparalleled ferocity, its defenders fighting to the very last man. At these crucial moments of breakthrough, as the Russian line teetered on the brink of collapse, Napoleon's marshals, their faces flushed with the heat of battle, pleaded with him to release his final, elite reserve, the Imperial Guard, to deliver the final, crushing blow. A decisive charge now, they argued, could shatter the Russian army completely and end the war. But Napoleon, from his command post, hesitated. Those who were with him later recalled that he seemed weary, perhaps ill, his usual decisive energy strangely absent. He looked out at the sheer, unimaginable carnage, at the astonishing resilience of the Russian soldiers who refused to break, and he felt a deep, uncharacteristic unease. "I will not destroy my guard," he said. "I am 800 leagues from France and I will not risk my last reserve." The moment for total victory passed. As the afternoon wore on, a brief and wild diversion occurred. On the Russian right, General Platov, the commander of the Don Cossacks, led 8,000 of his irregular horsemen in a surprise raid across the river, striking the French left flank and causing chaos in their rear. The raid was eventually repulsed, but it delayed the next major French offensive by 2 crucial hours and perhaps reinforced Napoleon's decision to keep his guard in reserve. By 5 in the afternoon, both armies had reached a state of utter, absolute exhaustion. The battlefield was a nightmarish vision, a landscape littered with the dead and dying. Infantry battalions were reduced to skeletal remnants, cavalry units so spent their horses could barely move, and gun crews collapsed beside their cannons, too tired to continue. As the light of day faded, so too did the fighting. The French, masters of a field of unparalleled carnage, expected the battle to resume at dawn. But dawn came, and with it, a profound and eerie silence. Overnight, Kutuzov, having grasped the terrible scale of his army's losses, an estimated 44,000 casualties, had made the difficult but strategically sound decision to withdraw. The Russian army, though bloodied and battered, would survive to fight another day. Napoleon had won the field, but he had not destroyed the Russian army. He was left in possession of nothing but a landscape of death. Reluctantly, Kutuzov made the decision he had dreaded. Moscow, the holy city, would be abandoned. Napoleon would have his prize, but it would be a hollow one, won at a terrible, terrible cost. A week after the blood-soaked fields of Borodino had fallen silent, the vanguard of the Grand Army crested a small rise in the road, and there it was. Shimmering in the crisp autumn air, a city of 1,000 colors, its skyline a forest of bell towers and the glittering, golden, onion-shaped domes of countless churches, Moscow. After months of endless marching, of dust and heat and deprivation, the sight of the ancient capital sent a wave of ecstatic relief through the weary ranks. This was the prize. This was the end of the long road. The soldiers cheered, their voices hoarse. They believed their suffering was finally over. On the 15th of September, Napoleon, at the head of his imperial guard, made his grand entry into the city. He had expected a moment of supreme triumph, a scene to rival the great entries of the Caesars. He had envisioned Russian dignitaries and city elders, the noble boyars in their fine furs, meeting him at the gates to formally surrender the city, to plead for his mercy, to offer him the keys to their ancient capital. This was how the great cities of Europe had always fallen. Instead, he was met with a profound, unnerving, and absolute silence. The streets of Moscow, which should have been teeming with life, were empty and deserted. The sound of the French army's own marching boots and the rumble of its cannon wheels echoed strangely off the walls of the silent buildings, a lonely, hollow sound. It was a ghost city. Some 90% of its inhabitants had fled, following their retreating army, leaving their homes, their shops, their entire lives behind. Soldiers peered into windows, seeing tables still set for meals that would never be eaten. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy, watchful, and deeply unsettling. Napoleon made his way through the deserted avenues to the very heart of the city, the magnificent and imposing Kremlin, that ancient fortress of the Tsars, and he waited. He settled into the opulent chambers, surrounded by the treasures of a conquered dynasty, and he waited for the surrender that was his due, the political victory that would justify the terrible cost of the campaign. But the delegation of boyars never came. The silence stretched on, hour after hour, growing heavier and more ominous with each passing moment. The great triumph felt hollow, a silent, solitary victory in an empty theater. Then, as night began to fall, a new and more sinister element was introduced. Fires began to break out. At first, they were small, isolated incidents, initially dismissed by the French command as accidents, or the work of a few of their own drunken soldiers or looters. A wisp of smoke here, a distant glow there. But soon, another fire sprang up in a different part of the city, and then another, and another, as if the city itself were developing a fever. By the next day, it was clear that this was no accident. This was a deliberate, orchestrated act of defiance. Count Fyodor Rostophin, the city's governor, had made a terrible and ruthless decision before he departed: Moscow would not be a prize for the conqueror. He had released prisoners from the jails and given them instructions to set fire to their own city, to turn their home into a great funeral pyre, an act of sacrificial patriotism on a scale the world had never seen. For 4 long days and nights, Moscow burned. The fire, fanned by the autumn winds, grew into a raging, uncontrollable inferno. It leaped from wooden building to wooden building, consuming entire districts in a sea of flame. The sky glowed with a terrifying, hellish light of orange and red, visible for miles across the plains. Napoleon himself was forced to flee the Kremlin as the flames drew too close, taking refuge in a country palace, from where he could only watch in stunned disbelief as his great prize was consumed by fire. When at last the flames subsided, the city was a ruin. 2/3 of Moscow, one of the most magnificent capitals in the world, was gone, reduced to a blackened, smoking wasteland of charred timbers and crumbling stone walls. With the city now a smoldering ruin, a different kind of fire took hold of the French army, a fever of looting. Discipline, already strained by the long campaign, now collapsed entirely. Soldiers, freed from restraint by the apocalyptic chaos, rushed into the still-burning palaces and churches, a frantic mob saving priceless treasures from the flames only to claim them as their own. They pulled magnificent furs from wardrobes, stripped silver icons from church walls, and stuffed their pockets with jewels and gold, a mad, desperate scramble for riches amidst the devastation. Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard carefully recorded the treasures he had acquired: pounds of sugar and rice, a woman's Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold, silver pictures, fine lockets, and a Russian prince's spittoon glittering with jewels. The army, once a disciplined fighting force, had become a band of treasure hunters, laden with plunder that would soon become a fatal burden. The emperor returned to the Kremlin, a stone fortress in a sea of ash. From there, he composed a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. It was an invitation for peace, a request to end the war, a final attempt to salvage a political solution from the ruins of his military campaign. He sent it with a messenger of peace, and then he waited again. But no reply ever came. The days passed, stretching into 5 long weeks. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights colder. The first snowflakes began to fall, a quiet, gentle warning of the new enemy that was approaching. Napoleon's position in Moscow became increasingly uneasy, then precarious. The ever-present Cossacks launched daring raids on his long, vulnerable supply lines, disrupting the vital connection back to Europe. Worse still, whispers and rumors began to reach him, whispers that his so-called allies, Prussia and Austria, were now in secret discussions with his enemies. The trap was closing. Napoleon had envisioned wintering in Moscow, using it as a base from which to launch a new campaign in the spring. That now seemed impossible. The city was a ruin, incapable of sheltering his army. His supply lines were being strangled. The Russian winter, an enemy far more terrible than any army, was about to descend. He had no choice. The army would have to move. It would have to retreat. Moscow had not been a prize, it had been a tomb. Part 9, The Great Retreat, Winter's Embrace. For 5 long weeks, Napoleon had waited in the ruins of Moscow, a conqueror with no one to accept his surrender, an emperor with no peace to be made. An uneasy quiet had settled over the blackened city, a quiet that was broken only by the whispers of an approaching winter. The first gentle snows of October had already fallen, a soft, white warning of what was to come. Then, on the 18th of October, the silence was shattered. General Kutuzov's Russian troops launched a sudden, sharp attack on the French advance guard stationed at Vinkovo. The blow stung Napoleon awake from his waiting game. The time for hope was over. The time for survival had begun. His orders came swiftly. The army would march out the very next day. The Grand Army, its numbers now down to around 100,000 men, poured from the city in a seemingly endless column, stretching for 10 long miles. But this was not the lean, swift army that had invaded Russia. It was an army weighed down by its own plunder. Behind the soldiers clattered some 40,000 carriages and carts, groaning under the weight of spoils looted from the fallen city. Women, both the camp followers who cooked for the troops and the army wives who had followed their husbands through war, walked alongside the soldiers. And in this great river of humanity were civilians, caught up in the tide of retreat. Every wagon was a treasure chest of stolen luxury, a testament to the chaos of the preceding weeks. Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard, his voice heavy with both pride and exhaustion, made a careful list of the things he carried: pounds of sugar and rice, a woman's Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold and silver, several gold and silver ornaments, and a piece of the cross from a Moscow cathedral. Over his uniform, he wore a woman's riding cloak lined with soft, thick fur, and at his waist, a pouch filled with treasures swung from a silver cord. The army carried more than just the weight of its loot. It carried the weight of hunger, of exhaustion, and, though they did not yet fully know it, the cold, tightening grip of an enemy far worse than any Russian division, winter itself. Napoleon's initial plan was to retreat via a new, southerly route, through the town of Kaluga, a land as yet untouched by war, where his army might find food and supplies. But Kutuzov knew the emperor's mind, and he moved to block the path. At the small town of Maloyaroslavets, the armies met in a bitter, savage clash. The town changed hands multiple times, but by the end of the day, the road to Kaluga was lost. For once, the emperor paused. He summoned his marshals, a rare act, and listened to their counsel. In the end, he made a dreadful, fateful choice. They would not try to break through. They would turn back the way they had come, along the road to Smolensk. It was a road that was already a wasteland, a path picked clean and stripped bare by the army on its advance. There would be no food, no shelter, only ruin. A few days later, Napoleon himself came close to disaster when a band of Cossacks nearly took him prisoner in a sudden raid. From that day forward, he wore a small glass vial of poison around his neck, a grim precaution against being captured alive. The descent into chaos began. Within days, the retreat brought them to the haunted, windswept fields of Borodino, where the unburied corpses of tens of thousands of men still lay, a grim and silent reminder of their costly victory. And then, the true enemy revealed its full power. On the 4th of November, the sky grew dark, and the snow began to fall, not gently this time, but thick, heavy, and endless. By nightfall, the temperature had plunged to 20 degrees below zero. The horses, already starved and overworked, began to collapse in droves, their frozen bodies left where they fell. Without the horses, the wagons had to be abandoned. The cannons, the carriages, the magnificent, useless loot, and most tragically of all, the wounded, were left behind in the snow. Order slipped away, and desperation took its place. The once proud army began to crack. Soldiers, their faces hollow-eyed and blackened by frostbite, turned against each other, stripping the dead of their clothes and boots. Some, weakened by hunger and overcome by the sheer, soul-crushing cold, simply sat down in the snow, falling into a sleep from which they would never awaken. The ever-present Cossacks circled the column like wolves, preying on any who strayed or fell behind. When Napoleon finally reached Smolensk on November 9, he found not a sanctuary, but more chaos. The first troops to arrive had looted the supply stores, leaving nothing behind for the thousands who staggered in after them. The emperor had hoped to rest his army at Smolensk, but there was no hope of that now. The army was starving, the winter was deepening, and the Russian forces were already moving to cut off their line of retreat. The Great Retreat would have to continue, deeper into the heart of a merciless winter, with the jaws of the Russian trap now beginning to snap shut. The worst was still to come. Empires rarely fall with a single, decisive blow. They unravel, slowly and painfully, thread by thread, campaign by campaign, until their collapse feels both inevitable and profoundly tragic. So it was with Napoleon. His final years of conquest, from the frozen roads of Russia to the battered fields of France, became a slow, grinding march toward ruin. The disaster of the 1812 invasion was more than just the loss of an army, it was the shattering of a myth. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was gone, and in its place, a new hope began to blossom among the crowned heads and subjugated peoples of Europe. The world itself, it seemed, was rising against him. The year that followed the Russian campaign brought no rest, only the formation of a new and powerful enemy, the Sixth Coalition. It was a grand alliance of nations, a continent united in its desire to finally break the power of the French Emperor. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and Sweden all closed ranks, their armies converging for a final, decisive confrontation. They met in October of 1813, near the German city of Leipzig. The battle that followed would come to be known as the Battle of the Nations, and it was a conflict of almost unimaginable scale. For 3 thunderous days, nearly 500,000 soldiers clashed in a titanic struggle. The sound of thousands of cannons shook the earth, and the ground was carpeted with the dead and dying. Napoleon fought with his old brilliance, but brilliance could not hold back the tide. The coalition armies, vast and unrelenting, pressed in from every side. The end came with a single, tragic miscalculation. A bridge over the Elster River, Napoleon's vital lifeline for retreat, was destroyed too soon, trapping some 30,000 of his men on the wrong side of the river. They were left to the mercy of the enemy. Among them was the valiant Marshal Poniatowski who, refusing to surrender, rode his horse into the river's cold, swirling depths and was lost. The Battle of Leipzig was a devastating defeat. Napoleon lost some 72,000 men, while the coalition suffered 52,000 casualties. But for the French, the numbers were catastrophic. The Grand Army would never rise to its former strength again. The world had learned from Napoleon. They learned that his genius lay in the decisive battle, and so they adopted a new strategy, the Trachenberg Plan, to deny him that battle. Their creed was simple: avoid the emperor himself, but strike at his marshals, starving his empire of its limbs. One by one, the walls of his empire began to fall inward. British gold, some 11.3 million pounds of it, fueled the Allied armies, arming their cannons and paying for the ruin of a man who had once seemed unstoppable. Even former allies, like Bavaria, now turned against him. And so, they came for his heart. They came for France itself. In the early months of 1814, Napoleon fought as he never had before. As the Allied armies invaded his homeland, his genius flared with a final, defiant brightness. In a brilliant six-day campaign, in the fields of Champaubert and Montmirail, he shattered the coalition's advance again and again, his small, exhausted army moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned his enemies. But it was only a flicker. There were too many enemies, and far too few soldiers. In March of 1814, the Allied armies reached the gates of Paris. The city, his city, the capital of his great empire, surrendered with barely a struggle. The banners of the coalition, of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, flew from its streets. And still, Napoleon would not yield. He planned to march on the capital, to fight one last, desperate battle. But his own marshals, the men he had raised from obscurity, the men whose names were synonymous with his own glory, Ney, Lefebvre, MacDonald, came to him at the palace of Fontainebleau. Their faces were heavy with a truth that he refused to see. "It is over," they told him. "There is nothing left to fight for." It was, perhaps, his truest and most painful defeat, a surrender not to his enemies, but to reality itself, forced upon him by his most loyal followers. On the 6th of April 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, bowed not to a foreign king, but to fate. He abdicated the throne he had built with his own genius, blood, and ambition. The Treaty of Fontainebleau sent him into exile on the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, a mockery of an empire for the man who had once ruled a continent. Europe, exhausted by more than 2 decades of nearly constant war, finally breathed again. At the Great Congress of Vienna, the kings and diplomats began the painstaking work of redrawing the map, of stitching nations back together with borders of compromise, of trying to restore the old world that Napoleon had so thoroughly broken. The cost of his ambition was counted in millions of lives, soldiers and civilians whose sons and fathers would never return. The empire was gone. The man was in exile. And the world he had shaken to its very foundations began, slowly and uncertainly, to find a new peace. As the gentle waves of the Mediterranean lapped softly against the shores of the island of Elba, the emperor slept. The man who had once commanded a continent, whose armies had marched from the deserts of Egypt to the frozen plains of Russia, was now the ruler of a tiny, forgotten kingdom. His empire of fire and conquest was gone, its grand ambitions reduced to the rocky shores and quiet olive groves of his island prison. And while he rested, the world he had so thoroughly broken began the painstaking work of putting itself back together. In the grand halls of Vienna, the kings, emperors, and diplomats of Europe gathered for the Great Congress of Vienna. They were like cautious gardeners, attempting to replant an ancient and formal garden that a great storm had completely overturned. With painstaking care, they redrew the map of the continent, stitching nations back together with borders of compromise and political expediency. Monarchs who had been driven from their thrones returned to their capitals, and a new Germany, united only in fragments, began to take shape under a loose and uneasy confederation. Their goal was to restore the old order, to erase the memory of the revolution, to put the genie of ambition and popular sovereignty back in its bottle. But the world had been changed forever. And the cost of that change was almost beyond measure. The years of nearly constant warfare had left a scar across the entire continent. The dead, both soldiers and civilians, numbered in the millions. Families from the villages of Spain to the great cities of Russia mourned sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. And the greatest killer had not been the cannon or the musket, but the silent, invisible enemies of disease and hunger that had swept through the vast, ill-supplied armies. It was a profound human tragedy, a testament to the terrible cost of one man's boundless ambition. And yet, the story was not quite over. There was one last flash of the old fire, one final, desperate gamble. Napoleon escaped from Elba, returned to France, and for a period known as the 100 Days, it seemed as if the legend might be reborn. But it was only a brilliant, fleeting echo of his former glory. At a small Belgian village named Waterloo, his final gambit met its end. Waterloo would not be his legacy, but a tragic postscript to a story that had already reached its conclusion. His true legacy, the part of his empire that would endure, was not built on the battlefield. It was something quieter, more permanent, etched not in the shifting borders of maps, but in stone. It was the Napoleonic Code. This comprehensive system of civil law was perhaps his greatest and most lasting achievement. It swept away the confusing and inequitable tangle of old feudal laws and replaced them with a clear, rational system based on the principles of the Revolution: equality before the law, the right to hold property, and religious tolerance. It bound nations together not with the chains of conquest, but with the foundations of justice. This code would not only shape modern French law but would become the basis for legal systems in countries all across Europe and around the world. And then there was the other legacy, the one that could not be written down or codified. It was the myth, the legend, the flame. The armies that came after him would study his military genius for generations, poring over the maps of his brilliant campaigns. But more than that, he had become a symbol of what was possible. He was the force of a single man against the tide of history, a testament to the power of ambition, genius, and an indomitable will. He had risen from obscurity to become the master of a continent, and in doing so, he had proven that the old world of fixed hierarchies and divine rights could be overthrown. He had lit a fire in the imagination of the world. In the end, the winds of history blew the banners from his hands, but they could not extinguish that flame. For history does not truly remember how a conqueror falls, but how he rose, how he dared, and how brightly he burned. And so, as the emperor sleeps his final sleep in his distant exile, the world that he had touched, the world that he had awakened, would never truly be at rest again. The great story continues, its currents flowing onward through time. But for you, now, the journey is over. There is only the quiet, the darkness, and the gentle peace of this moment. It is time to rest.